Let's create a program with a method definition. You can see I've already got the basics in place. I've defined a class with the same name as the file name, and I've got this public static void main string args line that we always use. Depending on whether you're putting this file in a root folder or subfolder, you might need a package statement, which would match that subfolder name. A method is a block of code that performs an action or task. The print method performs the task of displaying text, for example. It probably does all kinds of really fancy technical things to make the right pixels light up on our monitor, but all I have to do is call print, and that method will run. All the code we've written until now has been in a special method called main. That's the public static void main stuff we start with. Main is a special method that runs when we start a program, but we can create other methods as well, and they're really useful for breaking up our programs as they start to get bigger and more complex. For now, let's just put a simple output statement in our main method and run it just to make sure everything's working. When you're first starting out, it's good to run your program frequently to make sure there aren't any errors. And that looks fine for now. When we define a new method, we have to be really careful about where we put it. Our method has to go inside the class, but we can't put a method inside another method. So we have to put it either above main or below it. Either one's fine because the compiler is going to process the entire file before it runs, so it will know about all of our methods regardless of order. But I think most Java programmers prefer to keep main at the top so it's the first thing you see when you start reading through the code. That's different from a language like Python, where you have to define your methods first in order to use them because it's an interpreted language that's compiling as it runs and it doesn't look ahead. So Python programmers are probably in the habit of putting main at the bottom. I'm going to add a little space after the main method, making sure that I'm still inside the class. This shows why clean indenting and formatting are helpful. They make it easy to see how these blocks of code are organized. For now, our method definitions are always going to start with the words public and static, and we'll learn what those mean when we start talking about objects and classes. Next, we have to identify the type of data this method is going to return when it's finished running. We'll learn about that as soon as we have the basics of methods down, but at this point, I'm just going to put void because this method will just run without returning anything. And then at last, we get to something we've learned about before, an identifier or name for the method. Since methods perform actions, method names usually have a verb in them. Remember the print method, for example. It prints something out, so that's a nice descriptive identifier that is a verb. The conventions are really the same as with variable identifiers. You start with a lowercase letter and you use camel case to indicate new words. I'm going to call this method output college name because it's going to print out the name of the college. After the identifier, we'll add a set of parentheses. Method names are always followed by parentheses in Java. In fact, anytime you see parentheses in Java code, it's referring to a method. And I'm not going to come back later with an exception to that rule. Parentheses always mean a method. In a little bit, we'll start putting information inside the parentheses, but in this case, they'll be empty. But even when we don't put anything in them, we still need the parentheses to indicate that this is a method. And finally, our method needs a code block, which is a pair of curly braces. This code block is the method body, meaning whatever we put inside these curly braces will run when the method executes. We already know how this works because main is a method, and we know that whatever we put in that main code block will run when we execute the program because the program is just running main. So we can think of a method as a mini program. This method is just going to output the name of the college, which isn't the most exciting thing in the world. It's obviously just one line of code, but for the sake of the video here, I'll break it up into multiple lines using print statements. Really, I'm just trying to emphasize that methods usually have more than one line of code. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this program, make sure it's working. Well, it compiles and runs, but it's not printing the name of the college. This is a really common mistake, and even though I did it on purpose here, I have to admit that I make this mistake on a pretty regular basis. I've defined the output college name method, but I haven't done anything to make it execute. I forgot to invoke the method or call the method, which is how I usually say it. So I'm going to go back to the main method and call output college name. Since I've defined this method, it works just like other method calls we've done, like print, for example. I just put output college name, and then I have to remember to put those parentheses after the name. Notice that VS Code recognizes that I've defined this method, so it even has that as an autocomplete option. And of course, we need a semicolon to end the line. Now let's try running it again. Notice that we're missing some spaces. Remember that if we want to output a space, we have to put that space in our print call. Java won't add it for us. So I'll add a space after mountain. I could also put it on the next line before college. It'll work the same either way. And we'll run this version. That looks good. And because it's so fun, we'll just call that method a few more times. If I want this to output on the next line, I can just call print line with nothing in the parentheses, and it'll move the cursor down just like if we hit enter. And I'll run it again to see how that looks. Pretty boring, of course, but I'm demonstrating a point. There are going to be a lot of reasons we use methods, but the most obvious one is to let me reuse my code. Once I've made this method, then whenever I want to print out the name of the college, I can just call it. You have to kind of imagine that we're doing something really complicated instead of just printing something out. If it's complicated or long, we don't want to have to type it a bunch of times. I'd rather type it one time in a method and then use that method a bunch of times. Another reason to use methods is that they help make our code easier to maintain. My code has an error. It's printing Estrella Mountain College, but the name is really Estrella Mountain Community College. If I had been just manually typing all those print statements to make it output the name each time, I'd have to find and correct it in all those places. But since it's in a method, I just need to fix it one time. I'll go back to that method and correct my output. And now let's run it again. That one correction fixes the code each time the method is used in my program. Again, you have to imagine our method does something really fancy or complicated for that to seem like a big deal. We call this quality maintainability, and breaking code up into methods helps with maintainability. We can define as many methods as we want. I'll go ahead and make a method to print out another piece of information, the mascot of the college. Remember that we have to be careful about where we put the method. It's got to be inside the class, but not inside any other methods. I still want to keep main at the top, but it really doesn't matter if I put it before or after the method that prints the college name. I'll just put mine here. It's going to start with public static void again until we learn more about what those mean. And I'll call this one output mascot. Remember to put parentheses at the end even though they're empty, and create a code block to hold the code for our method. This time I'll just do one print method and have it say mountain lion since that's our mascot here. And this time I won't forget to actually call the method, so I'm going to go back to main and I'll just call this new method. And let's run this one more time to make sure everything works the way we expect. Okay, it looks good. Just one last thing to point out. One method can call another. And I think that's probably kind of obvious, but when we're first learning to code, sometimes we overthink things and make them complicated. I can go to my output college name method and I can add a line that calls my output mascot method. Let me run this and see what that does. Hopefully that's what you expect, right? When the output college name method runs, it's going to go line by line. It's calling the print method, and since I've defined a method called display mascot, it can also call that the same way. It kind of messes up what my program is saying or outputting, but it works just fine. Most of the programs you write are going to use methods. This shows how to define and call methods, and from here, we'll be able to learn how to make our methods more flexible and useful.